thank you for the warm welcome, and I bring with me greetings from the parish of St Mary and All Saints Dunsfold, which is right down in the southwest of the Diocese of Guildford, probably 3 miles further on and you're in West Sussex. It's a very different church to here, not only just in how many people would attend services, but it was built in the 13th century and has been described by William Morris of the arts and crafts fame as the most beautiful country church in all England. So I can't say I've visited all the other country churches to make a comparison, but we are blessed with a beautiful church and a beautiful place, and we're working on getting some more people to come along to our services. I must start by just explaining the title and why that is my branding, by the way. Ken's not upsetting me at all. One of my first bosses said to me, you should always read the post that comes into the office about articles we've carried, points of view, things you've written. So sure enough, I used to see this, and a few years later, this letter came in. Now, I've just been mentioning down here that I grew up in Manchester, to the north of Manchester, in a place called Worsley, which was and remains predominantly, I say, red. I may be dressed as a Manchester City extra in sky blue, but at heart, I was a red. Now, the funny thing is, you would end up with these letters of abuse from supporters of different clubs. And the letter that came in to me personally was from a Manchester United fan. And this guy said, I'm a United fan, have been for all these years, and round these parts we call you one-eyed, one-eared Walker because you're a Liverpool fan. I went, well, hang on, you've got that wrong. But I thought, well, I'm not going to start explaining it. That's your view. And in a sense, if that's what they thought and my reporting was independent and neutral, so be it. And the other thing that was the bottom line, the Cream of Manchester refers to a very famous beer that was brewed in Manchester and has had some great advertising campaigns. The Cream of Manchester was Boddington's beer, which is brewed in a brewery next to Strangeways Prison. Now, the only thing being, and you're all old enough to know this, things sometimes aren't as they seem. So Boddington's, the Cream of Manchester, is actually Belgium. It's a Belgian brewery that have bought it. It's sold on license. So what you're buying now in cans of Boddington is not what it was when we were lads and the pubs around Worsley used to be. Boddy's pubs. Well, it was at our Lent course a few weeks ago that I found myself reviewing some of the most painful moments in my life. The topic for the meeting that evening was finding true freedom. It made me review some of my turning points, the times when I'd faced stark decisions with consequences that would be immense for me, my family, and if I'm really honest, our financial situation. I told our Lent group how I'd spent 45 years in two very dubious, much maligned areas of employment. I'd been a sports journalist and I'd been an executive football director. Quick as a flash, one of the guests joked, David, you should have been an MP, then you'd have had the full set. I should add, the guest in question is a former Tory MP, so he knew about these things. From the year 2000, I spent 5 years on the crazy roller coaster known as working at a football club. The clubs were Leeds and Barnsley. Heroes to zeros, adulation to abuse. As the wisest football manager I ever met once told me, you'll learn, David, not to live in the Swiss Alps, where every victory can take you to the highest emotional point and every defeat plunges you into the abyss. The key is dealing with victory and defeat as small steps on your pathway, and you'll be fine. Just don't get carried away. That advice came from a man called Bob Paisley, who was a legendary manager at Liverpool, and who in his 9 years as Liverpool manager led his team to 20 trophies, including 6 league titles, 3 European Cups, and 3 League Cups. So I'm not sure how much time Bob had reflecting on failure and living in the abyss, but those were his words of advice, and they were very sound. In fact, after Liverpool won the European Cup for the first time in 1977 against the German team in Rome, the winners' party went on late into the night. The champagne bill must have been colossal. But over in a corner, quietly tucked away, was dear old Bob Paisley, the architect of this incredible triumph, and he was sipping orange juice. Now, Bob would have a beer, but that night he was on the orange juice. And he later explained, "I didn't want anything stronger. I just wanted to savor the moment and the immensity of what we'd achieved." In the press conference before that final in the Olympic Stadium, Rome, Bob was asked by an Italian journalist whether he'd ever been to Rome before. Bob said, "Aye, in a tank in 1945, and we won then as well." That was a VE joke for this week. I hope you accept. I met Bob when I was a young journalist. In all, I spent 40 years as a sports journalist, from the Cub reporter on D.C. Thompson's training scheme, eventually moving into national newspapers, and after my sojourn in football, back into the ultra-competitive world of sports newspaper executives. Christianity, though, had been at the root of my life. My mother was the daughter of a Methodist lay preacher called Fred Hughes. He gained fame around Manchester for his oratory powers. As I grow up, my mother would often say, "David, if only you had your grandfather's singing voice." Or then, "David, if only you had your grandfather's speaking voice." Or, "David, if only you had your grandfather's ability to capture an audience." And I see you're thinking exactly the same this morning. I went to St. Mark's Church of England Primary School in what back then was a village called Worsley. Then an oasis of calm and beautiful woodland, now an intersection where the M62 and M60 meet. Then a woodland haven full of rhododendrons and songbirds, now a place where the thrum of passing vehicles appears never-ending, 24/7. The oasis has been tarmacked over. As Joni Mitchell once wrote in her song, "Don't you know it always goes? You don't know what you've got till it's gone. They take paradise and put up a parking lot." But in Worsley, it was about 12 lanes of motorway. As a quick aside, I must tell you, and my friend here will confirm this, Worsley's strangest claim to fame. I'm sure many of you will have read George Orwell's novel 1984, which opens with the memorable line, "It was a bright cold day in April and the clocks were striking 13. Well, it was the third Duke of Bridgewater, who was the great landowner around Worsley, who commissioned the historic canal that linked Worsley initially with Manchester in 1761. It started underground where the coal was extracted and emerged in the heart of Worsley village. And to fulfill all the development requirements, Worsley became a hive of activity, with a quarry providing the required hardcore, the navigators digging out the route of the Bridgewater Canal as builders built the houses for the workers to live in. In the midst of all the racket, there was a clock tower built on Worsley Green to alert the hundreds of workers to their daily timetables. On one day after lunch, the Duke of Bridgewater was alarmed to see some men meandering back late from their lunch break. He asked them why were they late, and they explained that because of all the noise, they hadn't heard the clock strike 1. Hence, From then on, the Duke's foreman ensured the clock on Worsley Green didn't strike 1. From then on, it struck 13, and an excuse for being late after lunch was eradicated. It also gave George Orwell, or Eric Blair was his real name, a great opening line for his novel. Now, that clock was later moved from Worsley Green into the spire of the nearby St. Mark's Church, the parish church for Worsley. And to this day, at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, it still strikes 13. Now, as an aside to this, who lived in Worsley Green? Literally on the green in one of the cottages from 1943 to 1946, George Orwell. And when was 1984 published? 1949. So I think his insight into life in Worsley, the actual development, and it is still, you can look at it online, Worsley Village is a beautiful place, sadly spoilt, in my opinion, by the motorways that have been ploughed through what was woodland, but that's progress. I was blessed with growing up in a family where Bible stories were told and endorsed by relatives who were also committed Christians, a family with a dad whose business dealt with cash that my older brother and I would be asked to count to improve our numeracy, and with the strict understanding that stealing in any way was totally intolerable. You work to earn your pay, you never steal a penny. A week after my 21st birthday, I met the attractive young lady who would 18 months later become my long-suffering wife. This August, Pam and I will celebrate our 48th wedding anniversary, and we smile about how things used to be when we first met. And Pam is here in row 2, and you can ask her to confirm that this chat is true, and she'll verify it. For instance, one of the things we look back on is how, when we got married in 1977, Pam was paid more than me as a school teacher than I received as a young sports journalist. I was a kept man. That did change later, thankfully, to coincide with Pam becoming pregnant with our first child and me landing my first job on a national newspaper and more than doubling my wages. But now to some hard facts and disclaimers. I mentioned at the start about the notoriety of journalism and football executive management. So some brutal facts I want to share with you so you get an insight of what that world can be like. So, on the journalism front, I've never hacked a phone, I've never asked any of my staff to hack a phone, and as far as I'm aware, nothing that had been hacked on a phone appeared in newspapers that I was editing. Yes, across many titles, phone hacking was widespread, and the mobile phone numbers for celebrities were often provided by their management to help the media get a story. A few weeks after I joined Leeds in 2000, I was visited by a journalist I knew, and it was in the days when, I think I'm right, the biggest selling newspaper in the world, not just in Britain, was the News of the World, owned by Rupert Murdoch. This journalist explained how things could be done, and his mission was to get me on Rupert Murdoch's payroll. So I could be put on a weekly retainer, paying an agreed amount per annum, with the paper expecting me to deliver some juicy stories that I would undoubtedly become aware of in my role as a Leeds United director. If I didn't fancy that plan, I could be paid for specific information. Payments would increase from a run-of-the-mill story that might earn me £200, £250 to a back page splash that might earn me £2,000. A David Beckham back page splash, now you're talking, that could be up to £5,000. And a David Beckham front page splash, £10,000. I pointed out to my visitor that I was appalled. I'd never used this approach as a sports reporter myself, and I would not sign up with any newspaper or media outlet to sell information for any amount of money. If they had a story about Leeds and wanted to check it with me, I would help them. I wanted no money for doing my job and assured them I wouldn't tell lies to get them off the scent. A couple of months later, I was secretly approached by a football agent. His tack went something like this: I've heard if we want to do business at Leeds, we need to look after you. You're a man with a lot of influence here, so we can make it worth your while if you sign a player we recommend or renew one of our clients' contracts. There'll always be something in it for you. And if you're worried about the inland revenue, them getting on your case, we can help you. We'll pay the money offshore. You might fancy a holiday home, maybe in Cyprus. I felt insulted by the approach and made my position clear. There was no way I would tie myself to working with any agent or taking backhanders. My sole aim was to do the best for my employers, in this case, Leeds United. Those offers might have been worth a lot of money and transformed my family's lifestyle. They were tabled as a temptation, but they were wrong, and the Christian moral code I'd had drummed into me ensured it wasn't difficult to reject them. But corruption in football was evident back then, and the introduction of new regulations invariably just prompts new ways to get around the new rules. Pam and I discussed at the time whether my aversion to taking bungs might spark a backlash of some sorts. Guess what? A few weeks later, a sports journalist who I knew very well greeted me with the words, "Hey, it's David Walker, the scourge of agents." Now, I must say that in actual fact, I wasn't the scourge of agents, just the scourge of corrupt agents. I should have mentioned that Pam's father was called Canon Jim Beasley, a son of rural Warwickshire, but a long-time priest in the Manchester diocese. So throughout our early days going out, we worshipped together at her dad's church in Bolton, where her mum Mary was their tireless Mothers Union enrolling member. Throughout my careers in newspapers and football, I've remained a committed Christian, attending church every week, attempting to read about, pray about, and grow my faith. Then, in the 80s, came a series of events that severely tested my faith. In 1985, the people of a West Yorkshire city were shattered by the fire at Bradford City's home ground on the day their club was actually celebrating promotion. I was the Daily Mail's man in Yorkshire back then, and while I wasn't inside Valley Parade to cover the game, I had to work there for several weeks in the aftermath of the disaster. 56 spectators were killed. At least 265 were injured. The stadium was known for its antiquated design and facilities, which included the wooden roof of the main stand. Previous warnings had been given about a major build-up of litter in the cavity below the seats in the stand. In fact, that stand had been officially condemned and was due to be replaced with a steel structure after the season ended. But on that day, it took just 4 minutes for a small fire to become a deadly conflagration. The fans who escaped onto the pitch were the lucky ones. Those at the back, trying to use the emergency exits, found that they were locked. Those who made it back to the turnstiles, where they come in, found that they were locked too, and they were trapped. And many of the people who were burned to death were in those areas and affected by the searing temperatures. Many more people were unaccounted for. Some were so badly burned they couldn't be identified. Others were so stunned by events they simply walked away from Valley Parade and kept walking with no direction in mind. They suffered traumatic shock and needed psychiatric help. Desperate families would turn up each day to ask if the emergency services knew anything about their missing loved ones. And I will never forget one young mother who had lost her husband in the fire, but his body had not been found. The fire brigade had been searching through the ash, the rubble, the debris, and had found a gold wedding ring. They could find no sign of her husband's body, but the ring had their initials engraved on the inside, and that was all that remained of him. The government brought in new safety regulations regarding football stadia, but on April 15th, 1989, 30 odd miles south of Bradford, an even worse disaster occurred. I was a working journalist for the FA Cup semi-final between Liverpool and Nottingham Forest at Hillsborough. This was the day that truly tested my Christian faith. It was a day that began a campaign I've been involved in for the past 36 years, the pursuit of truth and accountability as to why 96 fans died on that day, with another fan dying later due to injuries he'd sustained. Anybody could see that to the left-hand goal, the Leppings Lane stand, the area directly behind the goal was grossly overpopulated by standing spectators, whereas the areas towards the corner flags and the wings were almost empty. And this was a long time before kick-off. The situation got worse. We now know the police froze and then panicked, opened the gates and allowed a flood of fans, some without tickets, to pour into the Leppings Lane stand. Instead of sending a cordon of officers to block the central tunnel leading to the already crowded section and direct the latecomers to the wings, the lack of strategic thinking made the situation even worse. Barriers snapped, fans were being crushed with their faces pinned to the fences while bodies piled up behind them. The rescue operation was in chaos. There was no sense of leadership or direction. That is the aspect that haunts me most to this day. It was bedlam. I made my way down to the pitch to see if I could help, and I'll always remember the old Sheffield Wednesday chairman, Bert McGee, seeing me on the touchline and saying, "David, it's terrible. I think there's been a fatality." I ended up helping some Liverpool fans load a teenage boy onto a makeshift stretcher. It was an advertising hoarding we'd ripped from the pitch side. I knew the first aid point at Hillsborough, and it was a gymnasium behind the stand opposite us. So I led them over there and we took the boy in. When we arrived, St. John's ambulance staff and policemen were desperately assessing the injuries and trying to save lives. I was wearing a sports jacket, a collar and tie. It was a working day for me. And one of the policemen came over and said, "Are you a doctor?" How I wish I had been, because I glanced down in that room and counted 4 rows of 8 bodies who had already been declared dead. In the press room, the briefings from South Yorkshire Police and the FA were already peddling lies. They told the media that Liverpool fans were responsible for breaking into the stadium and causing the crushing. Some police sources claimed the fans had picked the locks and opened the gates. Others said they'd broken down the gates. Out on the pitch, bewildered by what was happening around him, I met a Liverpool fan called Steve Mitten, a builder from Southport. I asked Steve if he had a ticket and how he had got into the ground. He showed me his intact ticket, which hadn't been checked at the turnstile. They'd opened the gate, so they hadn't removed the stub. They'd let him come in, but he had a ticket. And when they opened the gate, he'd been swept in on a human tide of fans who feared they were going to miss the kickoff and who were in an area, the pen, that was absolutely packed because fans without tickets had been allowed to get there. He insisted they opened the gates, the exit gates, to let us in. I told him that was not the version the police and FA were presenting as facts. Right, he said, you come with me. Let's go outside and I'll take you to the entrance and I'll show you what happened. He was right. The gate was intact. There had been no fans-inspired break-in. The lies had begun and didn't stop for over 3 decades. Since the original inquiry led by Lord Justice Taylor, I've been a regular witness at trials, inquests, retrials, and a second inquest. And it has been harrowing, and I must admit, when footage of the Hillsborough disaster comes on our screen, and I don't know if we've shown any yet, but I don't need to look at it. And if it's on a TV thing or a documentary, I prefer to look away than literally live through the disaster again. After all, that was a day, and in the days following it, when I questioned my own faith more than I've ever done. How could a loving God allow 96 people who went to watch their favourite team play in a football match perish in such harrowing circumstances? Within 2 days, the stench of a cover-up culminated in a Conservative MP for an area just outside Hillsborough briefing media outlets. And as the Sun infamously called it on their front page, Hillsborough, the truth. It was about Liverpool fans urinating on their dead and dying urinating on their dead and dying comrades and stealing from the pockets and wallets of the deceased. Other newspapers, including mine, checked the allegations and realized they were completely untrue and rejected the story. The Sun ran it, lock, stock, and barrel, and paid the price. Even today, 36 years after the event, newsagents on Merseyside refused to stock the Sun. Conversely, the drip, drip, drip of painful truth began to surface, included the fact that the FA had taken their showpiece game, an FA Cup semi-final, to Hillsborough, even though the stadium didn't have a current safety certificate. The Chief Superintendent, David Duckenfield, the officer in charge of policing at the game, had only previously been in charge of 1 game at Hillsborough, and that had been a midweek First Division match between Sheffield Wednesday and Wimbledon that attracted a mediocre crowd of 17,555. The semi-final was a 54,000 sellout. In my evidence at the second inquest in Warrington, I pointed out that at previous Hillsborough semi-finals, I'd seen police filter points where only fans with tickets could proceed to the ground. But that wasn't the case on the day of the disaster. It was a major tactical error that they let everybody who was arriving for the game to flood the areas around the stadium. Immediately, a South Yorkshire policeman was produced, a former officer, who said, "Mr. Walker's recollection is wrong. We've never had barriers and ticket filter points in place at Hillsborough." Now, the good news for me, and for the truth, was that by this point, the World Wide Web had been invented, and fans from many clubs were active from following the inquest on social media, such as then Twitter. So when they read that the police were denying my evidence, a storm erupted with fans from Leeds, Coventry, Tottenham piling in. They insisted there were filter points when their teams played in semi-finals at Hillsborough, and you only got to the stadium after proving you had a ticket. I was personally vindicated, and even more so when the Hillsborough Independent Panel, led by James Jones, the former Bishop of Liverpool, cited my evidence as being accurate and contradicting the police account. Sadly, I have to report that police statements had been clearly altered in the most amateur fashion, with paragraphs inserted with a different font and different type sizes, usually to act as disclaimers of any wrongdoing by the police. If I hadn't seen the evidence shown on the big screens around the courtroom, I wouldn't have believed it. In fact, I remember the judge asking a retired South Yorkshire police sergeant why the fourth paragraph in his statement was so different to the rest of it. Was it an addition? The former sergeant simply shook his head and said, "I don't rightly know." So I understood the blessing of eternal life bestowed on us via the death of our Lord and Saviour, Jesus Christ, on the cross. I could rationally apply the Christian doctrine to my own father's death, which occurred just 7 weeks after Hillsborough. I was shattered that I was away working in Dublin when I received the news that he'd died. But his age and history of ill health made the process more understandable. Yes, it was painful, but in a different way to what happened to those young people who went to that football match at Hillsborough. I prayed and prayed to seek understanding of April 15, 1989. It came to me when I analysed the phrase, "Death is not the end." The gospel message is of new life. In our own lifetimes and our own existences, we cannot begin to fully understand the eternity that God deals with. So to us, some deaths are so much more harrowing than others. We've all heard the phrase, "Oh, he or she lived a good, full life." Sadly, that couldn't be said about most of the Hillsborough dead. But eventually, and after much soul-searching, my belief in eternal life ensured that even though they had left our world so prematurely, they were now in God's safe care. And that is how I continue to remember them. Death is not the end. The pursuit of truth is a key reason to have a free media and hold the powerful to account. Hillsborough is the case I know best, when we have reason to question the version of the truth presented, or in some cases leaked, to us by government and authorities. But there have been other occasions where the cover-ups would have won if it had not been for the investigative powers of a free press. Let's not forget the post office Horizon computer scandal. Those poor innocent people imprisoned for alleged wrongdoing after their employers ignored the warnings of failures to the Horizon system, that went on for 15 years and perpetuated the wrongful pursuit of the innocent. Computer Weekly and Private Eye unearthed the scandal years before there was an award-winning ITV drama that did bring it into the homes of millions of people. And don't forget the blood scandal that has claimed the lives of 3,000 people treated with contaminated blood. And it was inflamed by a chilling NHS and government cover-up. I know there are flaws in the media, some of them indefensible, but I also know we need a free, independent media to uncover the lies of those in authority and who will use the lies to cover their own tracks. And let's be frank, it has happened in church life as well. Football clubs can be a harsh, superficial place to work with jobs depending on the variable results of your team on the field. At League One Barnsley, I was an executive director who was part of a takeover group who took over a struggling club in administration and on course to go bust. We guided them out of administration and set up a team that went and won promotion. It was in the South Yorkshire mining town that I met our brilliant club chaplain, the Reverend Peter Amos. Peter came in to see me and asked how I felt about him speaking to members of staff. I told him that he had my blessing. He could go wherever he wanted and come on a regular basis. Peter explained he'd tried his best as club chaplain, but things had been tough for everyone in the recent past with unpaid wages, uncertainty about employment. And I assured him there would be stability with the new regime, and he was welcomed everywhere, including my office. From then on, he would always visit me first. We would pray together, and then Peter would mix with the staff, from the players, the management, to the groundsmen. He simply wanted to give them some pointers to Jesus, to redress the cynical, superficial, testosterone-charged world many of them inhabited. He would hold prayer sessions. Some of the players signed up to join Christians in sport and became regular churchgoers. Peter told me he had never felt so valued at a football club and believed we were quietly transforming people's lives. Now, apologies, delete the we there and make it Peter and Jesus were transforming people's lives. I was an honoured onlooker, thrilled by what we saw. The results on the field improved, and there was an incident that, in my opinion, was truly revelatory of the work Peter did in that club. A lady called Jean was our long-serving receptionist and telephonist. She was a quiet lady in her later life and had received some shattering news. She had an advanced form of cancer. After consulting Jean, Peter asked me whether he could organise a prayer meeting to which he would invite every Barnsley Football Club employee. At this, we would specifically remember Jean in our prayers. Just like society in general, we all know it, Peter knew we had colleagues who wouldn't see the purpose of our prayer group. They wouldn't want to be at the meeting, and we respected that they might prefer to stay away. But the invitation went out. Everyone was included, and we set up the club dining room and waited to see how many employees wanted to support their colleague in prayer. Peter and I were astonished. Every single member of our club staff turned up. From dear old Norman Rimington, who had played for Barnsley, coached Barnsley, now in his 80s, worked as our part-time kit man. Every player on our books, from the first team to the youth team, and even the teenager who was on work experience and hoping to become a groundsman. They all turned out. Cheam was deeply moved. The overwhelming sense of unity in prayer was tangible. Cheam went into remission and lived for a number of years. She felt enlivened by the power of our prayers, and it's at moments like this that we must give thanks that our prayers are always heard, even if sometimes it's hard to understand the answers that we're given. We're all disciples. Disciple means one who is learning. Sometimes we learn things, need to unlearn others, and then relearn. But that is the path we walk in faith with God through his Son, Jesus Christ. I'm grateful that I found that route. There were times in meetings of newspaper executives where it was easy for them to belittle Christians, describe us as God-botherers and idealistic fools. In fact, it was after a meeting like that I went along to see my editor to point out, if I'd been a Muslim called Muhammad Yusuf, those executives wouldn't have dared to belittle my faith and speak to me and my faith in that way. He was horrified at his error and apologized profusely, and it never happened again. It's good when people are prepared to go and challenge what is being put, especially at denigrating our faith. It's even better the feeling that they've listened to you and respect the point you've made. You see, I realized many years ago, and with the offers of money and being a director at a football club and what it entailed, and the status of being in some of the most luxurious hotels in the world, I realised that life is not about status and wealth. And on that note, I want to finish with some words offered by the late Pope Francis, who said, "True happiness is not in having something or in becoming someone. True happiness is being with the Lord and living for the Lord and for love." And thank you for having me.
David, how can I follow that? What a spellbinding story from the inside. You know, we see it like the papers we read and we watch and so on. So thank you so much for sharing your story. I'm sure one or two people may like to ask you the odd question. Can I just to ask you about this question that people sometimes say, where is God in these situations? Because many of us have witnessed or sometimes have been in very difficult situations, and we find ourselves asking the question, where is God in this? How did you sort of work through that in a way?
That's the hardest thing when you've seen. I think sometimes if it's a small hurdle, you can easily get over it. I think that Hillsborough is cataclysmic to not just the ones in the stadium, but everybody who had family there, who witnessed the thing, who probably enjoy football. And that's where, as I say, I had to face up to the fact that this was death on a scale. I'm sure some of you may have military backgrounds, but it was on a scale that I'd never witnessed before. But I did believe, I got into this thing that God could be there, but there was this, what's the word I'm looking for? Accumulation of mistakes. Like, for instance, I'll give an example. I didn't put in here, but it's part of the story. A group of South Yorkshire policemen it was part of an initiation thing. They used to play pranks on the rookie cops, you know, a new PC had come, he'd be going on the beat. So they'd play a prank on him. And basically they'd let him go out doing his beat, and they'd creep up behind him with a car, and they'd jump up from behind and put a sack over his head and put him in the back of a van as if he'd been kidnapped. And it was the joke, but it was part of keep your wits about you, you never know who's behind you type thing. That happened from the Hillsborough police station, and the senior officer was a man called Brian Mole. And Brian Mole is a man who had a brilliant grasp of how to control things at Hillsborough, such as having the filter points, etc. Unfortunately for him, and he didn't know anything about the prank that was being played, but the young policeman, the rookie who had the sack put over his head and he gets put in the back of the van, made a formal complaint about it. Right? So there's investigation. What's going on? This Hillsborough station's out of control. Brian Mole was taken off Hillsborough, being the senior officer. He was sent, it sounds like a punishment, but it probably is. He was sent to Barnsley to work in the South Yorkshire, still for South Yorkshire, but in Barnsley. And that is why the police chief in charge of Hillsborough on match day had only experienced one game before. Now, it is the view of many people, particularly policemen, if you'd had the same senior officer who lays out, this is the blueprint, this is what we do, the disaster wouldn't have happened. So you're saying about, well, where's God in all this? That's part of the litany. What does that lead to? The police freezing, the incompetence, the not doing what was in the Brian Mole blueprint because of a prank 2-3 months before. And you start with that, and it goes on. The same thing goes. I mean, I'm not now going to defend Liverpool fans and everything. So, for instance, 96 Liverpool fans get killed at Hillsborough. One dies soon after, or a few weeks afterwards. They get into the cup final, and this view of football fans, I've got to be there. You know, it's the cup final. It's Liverpool versus Everton. We've got to be there. And guess what? They're throwing ropes out of a stadium that's sold out. It's 100,000 sellout. You've seen what happens if you overcrowd a ground, and yet they're throwing ropes to mates to climb in, so you're breaking the capacity of the ground. You know, it's crazy. So again, those are the individual things. You can't blame God for this thing. That's the decision. And you would hope somebody who is affected by the Spirit will be responsible. We can't do that. But I remember being and seeing the ropes, and what are these people doing? They're crazy. But that was there. we've got to be there. So I think you look at God is there, but some people in making their decisions along the way choose to ignore it, and we face the consequences.
Thank you. Okay, David, we could pursue this conversation. I mean, the slick theological answer, of course, is that we live in a fallen world where there is free will and exercise, but that doesn't address the question, the pain in people's faces and lives when that actually happened. Enough from me. Anybody got a question or a comment at all? Would like to ask anything? Yeah.
Thank you for your talk. You can probably tell I'm a Scot. My parents came from Govan.
Oh, Alex Ferguson's home part of Glasgow.
Well, they came from Govan. And my father wouldn't let my mother wear green.
No.
Comments?
Well, yeah. Well, he's just dealt with it, this gentleman.
Thank you.
Oh, right. Sure. Oh, absolutely. To those who, I don't know if you all recognise, and thankfully it's eased slightly, I think this refers to the sectarian divide that rules in many parts of Scotland, but especially in Glasgow, where for many years Celtic were presented and were founded by Roman Catholic priests, and Rangers became the Protestant club who were driven by directors who would never employ a Catholic at any place in the club. And, I might add, in more modern times, Alex Ferguson, who you know as the manager of Manchester United, was a footballer, a centre-forward, who Rangers signed from Dunfermline. And Alex Ferguson had grown up in Govan. His father worked in the shipyards, and Alex Ferguson is a Protestant. But to people inside Rangers, or some of the people, they didn't realise when they'd signed for them that his wife, Kathy, who sadly died 2 or 3 years ago, Kathy was a Roman Catholic. And at that point, Alex Ferguson's career at Rangers effectively ended. They wouldn't pick him. He was just left to rot in the reserves, and he realised he couldn't achieve anything there and moved on. The point of the story on that, but I'm just tying in with your Govan thing, is Alec used to have and I covered Manchester United day in, day out for however many years of Alex's, from his arrival in Manchester. He used to have a sign up across his desk, and it was in phonetic spelling, but if you read it across, it said, "I come for Govan." And he was very proud of his Govan roots. And I'll tell you something that he believed that sort of sectarianism was unacceptable to him, to the point that when he had been brilliantly successful at Aberdeen, some members of the Scottish press kept writing, "Oh, Rangers need a new manager, it's inevitable he'll go there." And on the basis of what had happened to him, that was the last place he was going to go and be a manager, because he didn't want any diktat about you can't play him. Now, there's a great payoff to this. Jock Stein, who was also a Protestant, became the Celtic manager. And Jock Stein was a brilliantly successful Celtic manager, and Celtic became the first British club to win the European Cup in 1967. And Jock Stein was asked, if you went out and you could see 2 brilliant young footballers, and one of them was a Protestant and one of them was a Catholic, which one would you sign for Celtic? He said, "I'll sign the Protestant." And they looked at him and said, "What?" He said, "Well, I know Rangers won't sign the Catholic." And Kenny Dalglish, who is lauded as one of the great Celtic footballers, grew up a Rangers fan in a Protestant area and is a Protestant. And the other bit on sectarianism, which ties in, there is this great view of Manchester United, because Matt Busby was a devout Roman Catholic, and you would go to games there, and the place would be awash with priests. There must have been so many free tickets. You see them all congregating, going up, collecting the thing, going into the game. And there was a view that Manchester United was a Roman Catholic club. Except Matt Busby was smart enough to work out that you don't pick players because of their denominational background. So, George Best, Dennis Law, and Bobby Charlton were all Protestants playing in this club that was supposedly pro-Roman Catholic. There were also Roman Catholics there, but nothing like we saw in Glasgow. And then it got broken when they started signing some foreign players.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
They were probably captain.
Well, they had to be, yeah, quite.
Thank you. Another question from anyone? Any observation? Yes, Marguerite.
Is it really the responsibility of the police to be involved in ticketing and who's allowed into the club?
Well, it's not the ticketing. The tickets have been sold, but the police are responsible and are paid for stewarding as such the streets in the area outside. So you've got to have a situation where if you've got 50,000 or 54,000 people arriving, you have to have a ticket to get into that area. And all it needed was on the streets, you have a barrier and they filter through and you say, show us your ticket or else you don't. And they might do it twice and they just filter out. But by doing that, by getting the people without tickets to stop at that point and you turn them away, you stop the overcrowding that was a leading part, a cause of the disaster that time, because the people who were in the pen outside were being crushed to death outside. That's why they opened the gate to let them go in.
We're going to stop now. Just to say, stories are interesting. I'm sure Nico could tell you stories about the rivalry in Buenos Aires between Boca Juniors and River Plate. I think I'm right in using those. And I may be, apart from Nico, the only person in this church community who has stood in front of Boca Juniors Stadium in Buenos Aires, actually. It was a far cry from the humble surroundings in Norwich and Carrow Road, which is where I come from. Just the tribalism in football is very interesting. When I worked in Africa, my students used to say, "Sir, you're a Chindeli." That was their word for a white man. They said, "You don't understand tribes." I said, "I can take you to cities in Britain and to regions of this country where the roads you live in, the street, your family name, with the school your children go to, or whatever, are all part of that." People might be interested to know that Andrew Thomas, who was a vicar here, a much-loved vicar here many years ago, and like me, a fanatical Norwich City supporter, we got into big trouble trying to get into the old Highbury Stadium because we arrived there and he was in a donkey jacket and they wouldn't let us in because he had a can of Coke in his jacket. Right. And we were forced to drink this Coke outside on the street before they'd let us in. And despite my protestations that he was a vicar, etc., didn't. So this business with the priests who got in on Busby's tickets was fascinating. On another occasion, we were at the old Den, Millwall, all right, and Norwich happened to win, and we were kettled, I think is the word they use, at the end of the match, and then we were escorted to the to the railway station, and we were walking along in the column with the police horses and the escort, and I spoke to the police officer next to me, and I said, "Look," I said, "why are you doing this?" You know, I said, "Look, I'm a teacher, my friend here is a vicar." And he said, "It's not you we're worried about, it's the Millwall fans we're worried about." So on that note, thank you, David, for reminding us, actually, I think of the words of Clive Myrie in the BBC television advert they do, "The search for truth goes on."
Absolutely.
And thank you for your testament to Christian faith and integrity in a world of sport, and that needs to be translated, obviously, into every other arena of life. So thank you very much for coming.
Thank you, and thank you for having me.